And a good Wednesday morning, Quad Cities. The time right now is 9 o'clock, and that means it is time for Ask Andrew Live. Welcome in to episode 5. This is something that we do every Wednesday morning at this time, exclusively soon on the WQAD News 8 Plus app. If you haven't heard about that app, by the way, it's on your favorite streaming device, aka your television. So if you have a Roku TV or a Roku attachment, an Amazon Fire TV or an Amazon Fire Stick or an Apple TV, you will have access to this stream exclusively. At some point, we're going to move everything over to the News 8 Plus app. So if you don't have one of those things yet, no worries. You still have time to get one of those, and we're still going to continue to stream and simulcast this on our social page, our Facebook page. And we're also going to take your questions from both sources this morning as well. So you can either put a comment on the Facebook stream or send us a text message, 309-304-0888. Your question, I'll be taking those weather-related only, of course, as we always say. Don't make it weird. We're going to stick to weather-related only topics this morning. Any question you have weather-wise, we will get that answered for you. Simply send us a text message there. Before we get into your questions, because I want to give time for folks to come into the stream and say hello, get their question in. We'll go through some of the big weather stories of today and this week, starting with what happened this morning. Oh my goodness, this was not surprising, but just the fact that we felt something this cold for the first time this season, quite a shock to the system. Take a look at some of the overnight low temperatures from all across the region, down to 24 in Dubuque this morning. That was the coldest spot I could find. Even Burlington was below freezing at 30 degrees. Here in the Quad Cities, we were down to 28. None of this, by the way, was a record low. Some of those record lows go down into the teens this time of year. So chilly nonetheless, a hard freeze this morning. That means it is the official end of the growing season in the Quad Cities region. And we're making some good recovery here in some spots. We're still in the 30s at this hour, despite the full sunshine. We're going to continue to see just a gradual, slow trend upward in temperatures as we head through the rest of the week. If you missed the forecast this morning, no worries. We're going to go into that in more detail coming up on GMQC at 11. And you can also find that at WQAD.com. I've had a couple of folks ask me kind of off the Ask Andrew stream here this week, what is our fall color doing? Are we getting close to seeing those peak colors here in the Quad Cities? And the answer is yes. In fact, our northernmost hometowns are going through the peak color as we speak, right up and along the Highway 20 corridor, north of Sterling Rock Falls, I would say up near Chadwick, Milledgeville, also Stockton, Galena, Savannah, Maquoketa. You are starting to see your peak color right now as we speak. So if you've got a trip planned for a little fall color peeping, this weekend would be the prime opportunity to do that. I've got it on my calendar to tell you how confident I am in this fall color forecast. And yes, I'll be heading north this weekend to view some of those colors in Galena. If you would like some ideas on maybe some really cool local spots to stop at to look at some of that fall color, a reminder, our fall color guide is still live on WQAD.com, and we'll have it up there for a few more weeks yet until we get past the peak color. But that guide has all of the local hot spots, all of the parks, everything else where it would be a really scenic view of those fall colors. Plus, it also has the fall color tracker that I just showed you in map form, so you can see where the best colors are at this time. And there's also a 7-day forecast for that color, so you can see how long it's going to stick around. Just simply scan that QR code on your screen, and it's going to take you right to it. The other big story, of course, is the freeze. That's what we just talked about, but I want to show you miraculously how on schedule our first frost and freeze was this year. We know how Mother Nature works. She's never on schedule, right? We took forever to get finally some cooler temperatures in here. We've been stuck in a summer-like pattern, what seems like forever, but an exception being with this. So what I did is I took all of the average first frost and freeze dates for every single year here in the Quad Cities, dating back to the 1930s, because we have temperature data that's very reliable all the way back to that time period. And what you're going to see on this graph here, every dot represents that first frost and or freeze. Down at the bottom is the year, and then over here on the left-hand side of your column, that's the day and the month of that day. This is the average trend line here in yellow, and you can see that average falls right between about October 14th and October 16th. So the fact that we had our first freeze today on October 16th, right on schedule, right with the average. Now notice we've also had some late frost and freezes up here too in years past, especially not really so much clustered all together here recently, but notice way in the past here from the 1930s roughly until about the 1960s to 1970s, we've had some really late ones that go back into November. The overall trend has been up. That's not surprising. Our fall season's getting longer, our winter season is getting shorter. No surprise that our average frost and freeze is getting later and later with time. There's a better view of that, by the way, and you can see how those dots are clustered. Thank you, Matt, for taking the banner off there so you can see the bottom. So the bottom is your year, the left-hand side, the day of the month, and you see how tightly clustered they are around that yellow line. But as I pointed out earlier, you've got a bunch of them here early on in the period, in the 1930s to 1960s, that were quite later than what we're seeing right now. Then it got a little bit colder earlier through this period, and then more recently we've got this clustering of numbers here later on in the month of October and getting into November. So the average is definitely trending up. But I thought that was neat. How often do you get something involving weather that's right on schedule? It's not often, that's for sure. Here's another hot topic that we've got going on this week too in terms of weather. What are the tropics doing? Because of course Florida, the Carolinas are still reeling from what was Helene and also Milton. Well, there is some disturbed weather that we're absolutely tracking, the first of which is still well out into the Atlantic. This thing is forecast to eventually become a tropical depression, perhaps a tropical storm, as we get into the upcoming weekend and early next week. It's a slow mover, though. You can see there's a 30% chance of development, further development in the next 2 days, 40% in the next 7 days. There's another area of disturbed weather further to the west and south of that, right here into parts of Mexico and also Central America. That's where we're starting to see, actually this would be Central America, excuse me. That's where we're starting to see some of these clusters of thunderstorms that could potentially migrate their way a little bit further to the north. Only a 10% chance of something further developing in the next 2 days, 20% in the next 7 days. So our biggest concern in the near term, not what's happening with that cluster in yellow, but rather what's happening with this in orange. We'll see where that ends up tracking. There's not a lot of computer guidance on this quite yet. We are actually expecting our first scheduled Hurricane Hunters flight to take place tomorrow morning. They will go in and investigate what's going on with this piece right here. The more data we have, the more accurate the models are going to be able to determine how far west and if this thing will eventually turn to the north. So as of right now, there's no immediate concern. This will be the one to keep an eye on. And hopefully with that data from the Hurricane Hunters coming in tomorrow morning as they go and fly through this thing, we're going to have a better handle as to what it's going to do. A reminder, though, that we're not done with hurricane season. It's been an impressive one so far, a list of all the names that we've already accomplished. There's been quite a few of them. Right now, the next named storm would be Nadine here on your list. And notice we're more than halfway through that list already, so it's been a busy one. How does that compare to the forecast and, more importantly, the average that we typically see? I bet we may have to lose that banner one more time. I apologize there. Thank you. But there you see our forecast, at least NOAA's forecast, was 17 to 25 named storms. So far this year, we've had 13 named storms. What about hurricanes? They were forecasting 8 to 13. We've had 8. And forecasting 4 to 7 major hurricanes, we have had 3 major hurricanes. And those are category 3 or higher in intensity. So there's still some more room for some major hurricanes, and also in the hurricane column too. I think there's still more to come here. Hurricane season isn't done yet. It doesn't wrap up officially until we get into early December, but there's the black line that's flashing. That shows you where we are in the season and the historical averages for the number of hurricanes, named storms, and also category 3 hurricanes. There's quite a bit left to go, sadly, in the hurricane season. Hopefully the rest of the storms will pivot out to sea and not give us any more impacts to the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic coast, but that remains to be seen. Here's the other big weather story, too, that we've been following the last several days. There is a comet that has been streaking our sky. The last several evenings, this picture coming in from Brian, and there's an even cooler shot. Talk about picture perfect here. You've got the harvest machinery and the shot of that comet in the background. This is from Luke Kinnear. A beautiful shot there. So what is this comet all about? Well, it's rare. The last time it flew across our skies was back when the Neanderthals were roaming Earth. That was 80,000 plus years ago. It will not return for another 80,000. So this will be the only time you'll see it in your lifetime, no matter your age. This comet is expected to remain in our sky as we go through the next couple of weeks. The only difference will be it's going to get a little bit dimmer, so it might be harder to see. You do not need a telescope. You don't need binoculars to see it either. You can see it with the naked eye. So when and where? Western sky. It's about 20 to 45 minutes post sunset. So as soon as the sun begins to set, that's when you want to start looking in the western sky. Just looking at some of our sunset times here, because that's an important number to have, obviously. Your sunset for this evening is going to be about 6:20. So I would say between 6:30 and 7 o'clock, that's when you want to get outside, look to the west. You will be able to see this again with the naked eye. Not a problem there. Also, don't forget to check out the full October moon coming our way tomorrow. This is known as the Hunter's Moon, and it is the second to last supermoon of 2024. We have one more supermoon to go. That is next month. But this month, the supermoon is actually notable because it is the only supermoon that's going to be the closest to us. We're having 4 supermoons this year, but look at the distance from Earth. 222,055 miles. That is the shortest distance of all 4 supermoons that we're going to be seeing. You could ignore where it says tonight there. You look at October 17th, 16th, Hunter's Moon. That's the moon we're talking about. Next month, it will be the Beaver Moon for November. Also a considerable distance away, but still close enough that it should be brighter and also appear bigger in the sky. The only downside to the supermoon occurring right now, in addition to that comet, is at times it might make it a little bit harder to see. Any extra light that we have coming in with that comet can certainly cause some issues, but don't forget to check out the big supermoon for the month of October, and then we will have one other supermoon coming our way for next month. I'm going to check out the live stream now, see if we can start answering your questions. I already saw one kind of pop up there earlier, so I'm going to pull that up and see what we've got. That came from Chad. He was asking if it's looking more like a light La Nina this winter, or are things still very much up in the air? Well, I can say still looking at a weak to perhaps moderate intensity La Nina. Right now, that is the going forecast, and that forecast is still very much on track. We did put out that winter outlook. It is at WQAD.com. The thinking is we're trending towards the colder than normal temperatures, and we're also trending towards more precipitation in terms of both rain and both snow. And how we came up with those numbers is we go back to past years that have had weak La Ninas, and that's what we come up with in terms of those numbers, taking the average of all of those. So how do we determine what La Nina is? You have to look at what the sea surface temperatures are doing in the east Central Pacific Ocean. Are they up cooler than normal? Are they warmer than normal? Well, in La Nina's case, they're cooler than normal. And if you look at the threshold here for what determines temperature-wise a departure for El Nino versus La Nina, we're absolutely going to be heading into a La Nina case, especially as we get into later this fall. Perhaps as early as next month, if not December, is when we're expecting to break through that threshold here to officially become a La Nina. But notice as we go through time, getting into next spring, it really doesn't dip down that far. So we're not expecting this to be a strong La Nina. We would want this line further down here for it to be a strong La Nina. It barely crosses over this La Nina threshold. So that's why we're thinking this is going to be a weak La Nina event, and that will certainly have, of course, some impacts on our winter weather here. If you're curious about those statistics, this is what we found again in case you missed it. Of all the weak La Ninas, the last 9 out of 12 of them had colder than normal temperatures, on average about 2 degrees colder than normal. At least 7 out of 12 of them had more snow than normal, averaging about 5 to 6 inches more for the whole season versus the average. And the last 7 to 12 weak La Ninas had a wetter than normal winter, averaging almost 1.5 inches more rainfall than normal. That is definitely a big, big deal. Carl in Monmouth is asking, what is the difference between a typhoon and a hurricane? Well, it's all about naming. Here in the United States for the East Pacific and also into the Western Atlantic, we tend to call them hurricanes. That's the name that we use. However, over on the other side of the globe, as you get closer to Japan, also Taiwan, those areas, they're called typhoons. There's really no difference in terms of their structure or how they form or where they move. That's just the other name that they tend to use for those. They call them typhoons versus hurricanes. Technically, typhoon kind of sounds a little catchier. It's a little bit of a catchier name, but that's just what they choose to use there. We have another one coming in from Chris asking, is our climate changing to be more arid, similar to Arizona? Yes, that is what we're seeing. And the biggest footprint of that is you look at our winters here in the Quad Cities, especially the winters that are not influenced by an El Nino or a La Nina type pattern. If you look at a neutral winter where there's no outside influences, you will notice that our winter is not only getting warmer, but also the winter is featuring a lot less in the way of snowfall, especially if you look at the winters lately, where it seems to be a struggle to get any kind of sizable snowfall to really stick around for, say, more than a week, more than 2 weeks. A lot of times what happens is the snow comes in, it sticks around for a couple of days, we get really warm, it tends to melt very quickly. So that's something we're seeing too. The amount of snowfall is consistently trending downward each winter. The other thing too is the cold snaps. We're not seeing nearly as many cold snaps as we typically did. So that's something else that we're noticing as well. Winter's getting shorter, fall is getting longer, spring is also starting sooner. Winter has the biggest climate shift, if you will, here in the Quad Cities. That's what we're noticing right now. Zika, I think, is that how I said it right? I think it's Zikia. Hopefully I said that right. Is asking what the weather is looking like for today in East Moline. Sure, I am always happy to answer a question like that if you're curious what the forecast is looking for today. Honestly, it's not that bad. I know it was cold this morning, but it definitely is going to be very comfortable as we get into this afternoon. And don't forget, that sun is still strong enough this time of year. If you're standing in the sun, even without a jacket and a light breeze, it's very comfortable. We're still thinking low 60s today, but we're going to have that big jump up in temperatures again as we get to the end of this week and into the weekend. Could some 80s or some places try and touch 80 degrees later this weekend? It's possible. We're going to be awfully close to that. But in terms of getting those mid to upper 80s like we had here recently, I think those days are wrapped up for the rest of the year. That is why. I don't think we're going to be seeing any more of those. You got to think too, if you look at what's going on the calendar, we're more than halfway through the month of October now. So it's harder and harder as the sun gets weaker and weaker to get those mid to upper 80s to come back in. But overall, really quiet forecast. Very, very quiet. And that's a case why I love we have Ask Andrew, because that gives me something else to talk about. I can't talk about very much when it comes to this. This is pretty boring. Ooh, did you see that? It works. Yeah, we put a touch screen up here. It's a new toy that we're going to be messing with here in the next couple of months as we figure that out. Let's see. A viewer was asking, have there always been hurricanes forming off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula? I thought hurricanes have always formed off the western coast of Africa. Great question. So they're rare, but there have been others that have formed in that location and then made that eastward track as opposed to westward throughout the Gulf of Mexico. There's not many. I know it's less than 5 when I last had to research that, but it is possible. It takes the right set of ingredients for that to come together. What made this one unique with Milton was the fact that not only it formed there, but you had a very, very strong cold front come in from the north into the northern Gulf of Mexico that helped push it in that easterly direction. In fact, it was the only Category 5 hurricane, Milton, that was on record that has ever moved in a southeast direction. That fact alone just blew my mind. But it was the combination of where it formed and the cold front coming in from the north with that really powerful Canadian cool air mass behind it that helped steer Milton in that eastward direction. So it is rare. You got to have the right set of ingredients together, and we did have that indeed. It is not correct to say, as I've seen a couple of Twitter and X accounts post, that this has never happened before. It has happened before. And from what I last looked up, the information from this, it's been at least a handful of times that we have seen a storm form in that same spot and move its way to the northeast. That is a great, great question. Somebody's asking, why are there names for hurricanes but not tornadoes or earthquakes? So the whole reasoning behind giving a hurricane or a tropical storm or whatever you want to call it, a name, is we want that to be memorable. We found in studies, when something has a name, it's more memorable. Now, you may notice too that there's another counterpart of ours in the land of meteorology that uses names for winter storms. I'm not really entirely on board, and I'm not really sold on using names for winter storms. But names for hurricanes, yes. Names for hurricanes are very helpful, especially in the case of when you have more than one that's going on. Say you have a hurricane in the Gulf that you're tracking, and then you also have a hurricane maybe in the Atlantic. Giving them two different names, I think, helps differentiate between the two. Otherwise, if you just say there's a hurricane, well, which hurricane are you talking about? So I think the hurricane naming thing is spot on. It's something I totally support and totally agree with. We don't name tornadoes because they're short-lived and they're very short-term events. Tornadoes only happen in a period of sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, depending on the tornado. So we do not name them. We just rate them on a scale of EF0 to EF5. Earthquakes don't get named either because, again, we're talking about a short-term, immediate event. A hurricane is a very long-form event. It is something that spans days, and in some cases weeks, depending on how slow the storm is moving. So hurricane names, yes, not a big fan of naming winter storms. Most of the time because you don't have more than one winter storm ongoing across the central United States. Sometimes you can get a couple, but I think naming the winter storms is a little bit overboard. I definitely do not agree with that. Great question, though. Thank you for submitting that. Let's see. How does the National Weather Service name the hurricanes? That is a fantastic question. So there's a certain set of criteria that they have to use for this. And of course, there are some names that are retired. We talk about those constantly. One of them takes after my first name. You're never going to see another Hurricane Andrew. You're never going to see another Hurricane Katrina that is coming through. So there's a retired list that does not get used again. And then there's a list that is maintained from an international committee that is called the World Meteorological Organization. This committee actually puts out these naming lists, and they actually have the list out all the way through 2029. They come up with these names. And it's interesting, too, because if you've been following weather long enough, you're going to look at these names on this list, and you're going to say, wait a minute, I remember we've had a Hurricane Dolly. Or I remember Gert. I remember a tropical storm Gert. I think there was even a Hurricane Gert at some point. So these names do get reused and recycled as long as they're not retired from the naming list. But it's the World Meteorological Organization that meets, comes up with that list of names, and then they put it out. And right now that list of names is out through 2029. And I actually just pulled a couple of those names off that list too. So if you're curious, if you want to see if you're going to have a hurricane or maybe a tropical storm named after you in the next 5 years or so, you can check out their website. It's nhc.noaa.gov, and the page on that is about names. You'll be able to look that up pretty easily. But that's a great question. Really, really good question. Cindy's asking, why do acorns fall in the morning starting about 5:36 and stopping about 7:30 and 8? I don't hear the acorns falling throughout the day. I'm up at midnight and I don't hear them falling either. Is it weather related? I am not an arborist, but I can tell you, just based on the little bit that I know about trees and their cycle, that most likely it's happening at that time in the morning because it is the coldest part of the day. Just before sunrise is when we see the coldest temperatures logged for the day itself. And how trees behave, especially a certain tree this morning, if you have a ginkgo tree, you likely saw it lose all of its leaves this morning. They probably all just fell down to the ground at once. Well, what the trees are doing is they're starting to seal off the edge of all of their branches. This cold air is a signal that that process needs to be underway quickly because we obviously know it's coming later down the road, winter, when we're going to be dealing with sub-freezing temperatures for much longer periods of time. So not being a tree expert, that's my best reasoning for that, is that the trees are responding to the coldest part of the day by sealing off those branches. They're getting that cold air activation signal to do that. That's a great question, though, for Craig Hignite. And you know what? Today is Wednesday. He's going to join us for GMQC at 11, and I'm going to hold on to your question, and I'm going to ask him about it. So stay tuned. We'll get that answered for you by an expert, a tree expert, that is, coming up later this morning. We'll see if my educated guess was right. How about that? we'll see how that ends up working. Brett is wondering if we're going to see thunder snow this year. You know, something I've noticed, and Morgan can probably vouch for me on this too, it seems like every winter we're seeing more and more thunder snow. How many winters have you been here, especially, that you've seen thunder snow?
I feel like it's definitely been more common the past couple years.
Especially the last couple of years, I think, yeah. So if I had to guess if we're going to see thunder snow this year, I'd say yeah.
Yeah, the first time I experienced it was in college, and then I moved out here.
Yeah, exactly. So she's seen it a few times. I know that I've seen it, especially the last 2-3 winters that I've been here. So I think it's a good bet we're going to see it again. And it's all a part of, again, the fact that we're getting warmer and warmer winters. That allows some more ingredients to get some thunder snow to start developing in here. You get a little bit more instability. That certainly doesn't hurt things when it comes to thunder snow. If you've never experienced it, though, oh my gosh, yeah, you have your own personal Jim Cantori moment, essentially. You start screaming and everything else. Don't forget, though, that, you know, it's just like a thunderstorm. If you see it, you should get inside really quickly. You can still be struck by lightning. Just because it's snowing doesn't mean it's any different there. Chris and Kayla from Walnut asking, can you help educate us on what thunder snow is and if tornadoes are possible in blizzard situations? So the only difference between a thunderstorm and thunder snow is that you have snow falling versus rain falling. You're not working with nearly as much instability as you would with a typical thunderstorm. You're also not dealing with a whole bunch of rotation either. So you're not going to really experience the same effect with a thunderstorm versus thunder snow. There's really no difference other than one is raining and one is snowing. That's the main thing. I'm trying to poke through my content library, though, to see if I have anything related to thunder snow and its formation, and I do not see anything. So I must not have made a graphic on that, but I can tell you, yeah, there's not much of a difference when it comes to the two, other than, yeah, you're not going to see a tornado with thunder snow. That I can guarantee you is not going to happen. I think we have another question that is coming in. Let's see. Marcus, I bet I know which Marcus this is. It's probably my Marcus that I know. Is it common to be in a drought this time of year, and what causes the lack of rain? Yes, it is very common to be in a drought this time of year. More specifically, what is causing our lack of rain here in the Quad Cities? The biggest fault lies within a strong area of high pressure that has been right near us for most of the last couple of months. We just can't get that thing to budge. And the reason for it is likely because of all of the activity we've had in the tropics. We actually talked a little bit about that this morning for Ask Andrew. So I'm going to actually go back to that because that graphic actually showed it really well. Mother Nature is all about balance. So let's talk about that really quick. When you have a lot of low pressure in the Gulf of Mexico or even further south than that, Mother Nature tries to balance it out by giving us an area of high pressure somewhere in the nearby vicinity. Well, our nearby vicinity happens to be right in the center part of the country. Hurricanes, of course, very low pressure associated with those. Really, any tropical system has low pressure associated with it. But in order to balance that out, you need an area of high pressure. Mother Nature does not like imbalance, and pressure imbalance is one of her biggest pet peeves. So that's why we have an area of high pressure that remains just stationed right overhead. We're also kind of involved in what we call a blocking pattern, where we have multiple different high pressure and low pressure systems that are kind of stacked on each other. That doesn't allow for things to move really quickly. So we're still stuck in this holding pattern. We're still waiting for something to kind of break this free. There are indications that we might start to transition out of this as we get closer to the end of the month, but it looks like the remainder of October does look fairly dry. And if there was one month where we were going to dry out, especially this time of year, it's typically in September going into October as you're in that transition period of going in from summer to fall. You don't really tend to see a whole bunch of big storm systems. But when we start getting closer to winter, that's when you'll start getting your really big sizable storm systems to move in here. That should kick up the rainfall and also should ramp up the wind machine too, as those pressure differences get much, much larger as the temperature differences begin to grow. I think we have caught up with all of the questions this morning. You guys are amazing, and the timing was perfect as we're getting ready to wrap this up as we approach the 9:30 hour. So I want to thank everyone for joining me here this morning for episode 5. A reminder, we're going to be right back here next week, same time, same place on the WQAD News 8 Plus app. If you haven't put it on your smart TV yet, Do it now, whether you have a Roku, Amazon Fire Stick, or Apple TV. It is available and it is streaming free 24/7. I'll see you later this morning on GMQC at 11.
Continue with us and watch free now on the 8 Plus app everywhere you stream.